So this is such a hot topic, feeling hurt and anger. So I like to bring in other resources and teachers, which we'll do in a minute. But before we do that, I wanted to just come back to ways to regulate as we're doing this. So as we're doing the inquiries, they're meant to kind of stir things up so that we can look at them. And we also want to take care of our nervous system. So just a reminder, you can do the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You can look at 5 things and say them out loud. You could do box breathing, inhaling, holding for 4, hold, exhale for 4, and then hold. You can do something like that, or you could stand up and shake it out of your body. And then all of the other things that we do as well, tapping and all of those things. So, this somatic mindfulness that we're working with isn't just when we're sharing, it's also when we're doing this part, especially when we're doing this part. So, really keep an eye on what's going on in your nervous system. And if you feel like you need to back away from it a bit, then just do that. You could even turn off the sound on your computer for a bit, or stand up and walk away and then come back. These will go out to everybody afterwards. So whatever you missed, you can always catch up on later. So Love and Rage is a book by Lama Rod Owens. The Path of Liberation Through Anger. He's a Buddhist teacher. And some of what he's talking about I find really relevant here. He's talking about anger as the mental and physical tension of being emotionally hurt. So we're talking about the hurt that underlies anger. And oftentimes we don't get to the hurt because the anger is so consuming. So part of what we'll do is work directly with the anger and the fight response. And part of it is that we'll come into the underlying hurt. So this is from his book, Rage, Love and Rage, that aversion and rigidity arise from this tension of we have the anger and we have the hurt underneath it. And then the energetic force of anger distracts us from self-care into self-protection. So we need to take care of ourselves while we're trying to figure out how to be safe. And the safety will always trump. It will always overcome the self-care. So if somebody finds that after they've had some kind of a trigger, or they're feeling afraid or anxious, that they're eating more, maybe they're shut down, they're sleeping more, or they're not sleeping, that we go into these self-protection modes and that takes priority. And that also helps to explain a little bit why it is that we have this experience of forgetting about our self-care when we're in these kind of situations. So anger is trying to tell us something. It's not the main event. And if we think about when we feel anger, it's clearly in response to something. We don't go around as a clean slate. We wouldn't go around being angry if there wasn't anything to be angry about. And then we go back to this predictive quality of the brain, which will say, it kind of stores everything. So sometimes we will be walking around with a lot of rage. And if we look into our past, we can find out what it is that created that. But it's not the natural state of a human being, isn't to be angry. There's always some reason for that. And this tension arises from not being able to be with the hurt and from being in despair because of our situation. So sometimes we can be, especially as a child, when we're hurt, we're really hurt. And, it might happen with a partner or at work or other people, that we're excluded, or someone's shaming us or saying, gossiping about us behind our back, or all kinds of situations in which we're really hurt. And then we have some kind of a response. And oftentimes that's a fight response or an anger. And when anger and rage are turned inwards, we know this, that they eat away at ourselves. And we really can't be happy, joyful. We can't be present because we're suppressing often the anger, or we're turning it against ourselves, and we have that mean inner critic inside. So that we need to metabolize our anger in our body by feeling it. And then, only then, can we come out of, and I'd like to, he doesn't talk about the fight response, but I'd like to weave that in. Only then can we come out of the fight response and come into, how do I feel and how can I appropriately express this and not suppress it? So we get angry when our expression of personal power is hampered, which I thought was such an interesting way of looking at this. And Lama Rod has had a long history of explosive anger and of passive aggressive anger, which he talks about in his book as well. And so he's talking about and he's really looked at when he feels angry and what's going on. So he's one of those people that's spent, I don't know, 20 years working with anger, which is really illuminating because most of us aren't that aware of all of the underground patterns here. So, what does anger do for us? If we feel weak or helpless or overwhelmed, it helps us to avoid that feeling. Most of us would rather be angry than overwhelmed. It helps to move us out of freeze into fight. So, if we think about the polyvagal ladder, the state of freeze is a dorsal, they sometimes talk about dorsal. It's below the diaphragm, it's really primitive brain, and we can't do anything when we're in a freeze response. When we're in a fight or flight response, we come up the ladder into a sympathetic arousal, and we need to come up into that before we can come up to ventral vagal, which is the state of trust and connection. So we sometimes, the energy of anger can bring us up out of the freeze response. And we might not want to be in the fight response, but we need to move through that to get up into the ventral vagal and the trust. Sometimes it gives us energy to push through our situation. And also, it can clear a space around us. And so, if we're angry, a lot of times people will get out of our way. And that's not something that I have a lot of experience with because I have more of a freeze response than a fight response. But it's true that it gives us that energy to push through a situation, but it also clears space for us. Some of those are more of the fight response, but feeling angry also helps us to stay connected. So if we feel like, well, if I'm not angry, does that mean that it doesn't matter what happened to me? And so holding on to our anger can be the only way that we can validate for ourselves or validate for others. And oftentimes we'll find ourselves really talking about what's gone wrong or people that have hurt us. And part of that is that we need some validation that yes, we were hurt and yes, we matter. And so staying connected to the anger and the suffering can help with that. And then if we look at social justice movements, bonding against a common enemy helps us stay in solidarity with each other. And so if we don't have that, then how would we be inspired to action? And I don't in any way want to say that we need to be angry in order to have empathy and to be able to connect on a level ground with other people who are marginalized. I certainly don't mean that. But just that sometimes that bonding creates an anger at whoever it is that's causing the suffering. And that can help us to know that we're not alone, that we're part of this group. And again, that we can avoid feeling hurt and despair. That's one of the things that anger does is it has such a powerful hot energy that it helps us to avoid feeling that. So there's a wisdom power of anger, another of Lama Rod's phrases. So we've been abused by lots of different types of power, gender, race based, all kinds of cultural, hierarchical, personal power. We're abused in homes, we're abused in relationships. There's always a power over and a power under in almost everything that we do. And it takes a lot of care and personal work to get to a place of not being cowed by someone, not being fawning to somebody with more power. And all of that is a strategy that can create a lot of anger and a lot of suppressed anger as well. So loving ourselves is something that's hard to do when we're in a fight response for sure. And it's hard to kind of come back into that common humanity. We often forget the humanity of others. So if we can take care of our hurt and we can love ourselves and other people at the same time, as we feel the anger and maybe band together with others, but also just to really let the sharpness of anger cut through the denial and the distractions and really focus on what it is that's important here and how are we going to maintain the energy to work with that. So I wanted to go now into the fight response versus the feeling of anger and expressing our anger. So we've talked about the fight response quite a bit. And it's this reactive nervous system, primitive brain attempt to protect ourselves. So when we talk about it was not safe for me to express or even feel anger as a child, that's our primitive brain, our nervous system saying, your best option to survive this is to not challenge the person. And sometimes a child will challenge a person, or sometimes they'll get to a certain age and they'll challenge them. But oftentimes, our response as a child who has very little power is to avoid the situation, try to avoid triggering them into rage. Sometimes we'll go into a fight response. Often it's a freeze or a flight. We'll just get out of there. We'll go and hang out at a friend's house, or there's a lot of ways that we try to protect ourselves as children. But when we're in a fight response, and this is one of the most important things, is that we're emotionally flooded. And, Gabor Mate talks about the effect of trauma as being that we disconnect from ourselves. And when we're emotionally flooded, we're disconnected from ourselves. And we're avoiding feeling the hurt under the anger, which is another way that this whole process works. The fight response gives us that sharp, passionate energy to make a change. And at the same time, we can just get enraged and then we forget about our humanity. We disconnect from ourselves and from other people. So emotionally flooded it's cortisol and adrenaline primarily. There's a lot of hormones flooding through our system. We tend to lose touch with ourselves, but it takes about 20 or 25 minutes for that to settle. And also, I find that if you have a lot of that going on, if you have a lot of the fight response, it tends to kind of hook your brain. It's a very high energy situation. And our brains get hooked on the hormones and chemicals that run through our body and our brain. And so if we have a lot of fight response, then we can find ourselves kind of savoring that in a way, or more susceptible to feeling that, because we feel very alive and we feel maybe more powerful than we feel when we're not protecting ourselves. So that's something that I think is really good to know. The whole emotional flooding thing is that we're not fully capable of being responsible for ourselves in that moment, because we have this immense hormones and chemicals are flooding our body. It's very primitive brain mammal response. And as an adult and as a human with a higher level brain as well, we don't want to just let our emotional flooding take over all the time. So that's part of what we're doing with the practices and this internal work, the deep inquiry of what is it that's stimulating me to go into that state, and how can I stay grounded when I start to feel that that's coming up. So the anger in our body brings up associated thoughts. So we get into that emotional flooding, or we just get into a state of anger. And then we start to remember things in the past or things that are going on right now. And when we're just feeling it, we can stop that recycling. So we have all of these justifying thoughts. I had to return something this week, and it's been like a month and a half since I got it. And I'm thinking, wow, they probably have a 30-day return policy. And I'm going to have to phone and I'm going to have to talk them into giving me special treatment. And I'm going to and I found that I was kind of avoiding making the call. I didn't make it for a couple of days. And then I found myself getting kind of angry. Well, they should blah, blah, blah. And then I'm like, okay, Lynn, just deal with it. So I went online and I looked on my receipt. They had a thing about the returns and it said they've extended it to 120 days. I'm just like, wow, I was getting myself all geared up into a fight response and feeling all kinds of thoughts were coming in. And that's such a simple example that really doesn't mean that much. But the more meaningful things happen with similar kind of a process. So I think it's very helpful to notice what's going on in our thoughts, in our body, and can we feel the sensations of that? Can we stop? One of the things that I think is helpful is to look at those thoughts. And when they come in, okay, why am I doing those kinds of thoughts? What's going on here? And then to come back in and really feel it. So let's just sit with that for a moment and bring up whatever might come up for you as you're thinking about that. Your fight response, what is your experience with that? And not to share yet, but just to notice, what is your experience with that as you're thinking about that? And then the feeling of anger helps us to clear that reactivity and opens up that space for vulnerability, clarity, and truth. So we come back to ourselves, we connect with ourselves again. So whether you're feeling it by doing something physical to let it flow through, or you're screaming into a pillow, or whatever it is that you might be doing, or maybe you're coming in and feeling the anger in your body and you can describe it. It's in this part of my body, it feels hot, it's moving. Feeling that and then doing the inquiry really helps us to let go of the fight response and come into this connection with ourselves. So let's come back to the hurt. The next couple of slides involve the inquiry. But before we even go into the inquiry, if you wanted, you could put your hand on your heart, kind of feel the warmth, feel that pressure of your hand. But taking care of our pain softens our hurt. And then we can empathize with ourselves. So if you're thinking about something that's hurt you and something that you've gotten angry about, and it might be something that has happened over and over for decades, it might be some smaller thing. When we go into the pain and we feel the hurt, then one of the steps that we often will take is, can I offer myself some empathy and compassion? Could I could I see that this is a common normal response to be hurt by something like this? And if I've been defending myself with anger, I can come back into my body and feel the hurt. And that when we can empathize with ourselves, we can empathize more easily with others. And it's this loss of humanity, this that we forget other people's humanity, that makes it hard to act in a reasonable way and act in a way that we're going to be happy with. That it's the losing of that humanity of other people that often leads to a rage response or leads to some kind of harm with the expression of anger. So if we can hold the love and compassion in our humanity, then that empathy is what will start to disrupt the systems that create harm. And we can think about that as gender based violence, for instance. If we could actually have more of a connection, less of a disconnection. For me, one of the ways that works is that I have a son and I have two grandsons. And it's hard for me to completely write off men, partly because my son is a very strong feminist and is really raising his boys to be aware and feminists as well. But also because I can see I have a more realistic or a more balanced perspective on how gender based violence works and how men and boys are not nurtured and that they're, there's this entitlement. And I can see the whole picture. And then also look at people as with a more of a connection. Whereas in the 70s and 80s, when I was more in my angry years and was very involved in activism, I didn't always see men and boys as people. I mean, I did to some extent because I had a son, but it was hard for me to see them as a person because their foot was on my neck and I wanted it off. And so we have all of these very complex patterns and experiences and hurt that are going on. And at the same time, if we can connect with our own humanity and connect with the humanity of others, it doesn't mean that we stop being an activist, but it means that that's one of the ways that we can open up the space for real connection and healing. Let's do the inquiry. So this particular structure, we look at beliefs that we have on the one side, and we have freedom on the other side, and then what's in the way of us experiencing freedom. So one of the ways that we might describe emotional freedom is that emotions move through. Anger doesn't make me forget the humanity of myself and others, and that I appropriately protect myself. So it's not about everybody gets to do whatever they want. I get to feel anger if that's justified. I get to express it in a way that makes sense for me, and that I'm not suppressing it and I'm not raging. So that would be freedom, the way I would look at it. And then we have our personal experience of fear, and it's not safe for me to express anger. And that might be very valid and true from when we were younger, or maybe not even that much younger. Or we might be afraid that if we feel our anger, then it's going to automatically lead to an explosion or a fight response. So take a look at both of those sides, and the middle of the inquiry. One of the focuses that we could use is, what is the hurt under the anger? So if we continue with gender-based violence, part of the hurt is being objectified. It's not being seen as a person. It's being shamed. It's being discriminated against. There's a whole continuum of experience with that. It's being afraid to go out at night. It's all of the ways that we've worked with that and adjusted our lives, and all the ways that we've been hurt. If we're looking at something personal in the sense of within a family structure, there could be something that relates to that. It could be other things too. In my family, I was a scapegoat. Nobody ever paid attention to me. They all just abused me in some way. So, what is the hurt underneath the anger? And then the inquiry might be, I can afford to feel the hurt and betrayal, or I can afford to feel the direct anger of energy without expressing it. So we'll take about 7 or 8 minutes for this. So you have a little bit of time. It's not enough time to go completely into it, but just to notice, what is it that you're drawn to here on this page, or what you've been listening to? And what is it that you would like to sit with? Is it the hurt? Is it the feeling of anger? And let yourself stay very grounded and present. Stay with your breath. Take a break if you need to. Back away from it. Do the breathing, tapping on your forehead, whatever it is you need to do. And really notice if you're getting really engaged in angry thoughts. And that's fine if you are. But see if you could do something to help you kind of move those through. It might be that in your mind's eye, or if you have, if you're in a situation where you could do it, that you might kind of mentally turn towards the person that hurt you and yell at them. I'm furious because, or whatever that might be. Or you might be coming back into the hurt. What is it that's hurt? What's the soft spot underneath the anger? But stay really present in your body and work in a way that feels okay for you right now. And remember to stay here in this moment where it's safe. So if in your mind you're turning towards someone who was raging at you or who hurt you and you're expressing your anger, stay really present in your body. Remember to breathe. Look around the room. Remember that you're safe right now. You're not back there. Stay here in this moment. And notice what you're focusing on and do the opposite of your usual pattern. So if your usual pattern is to go into a fight response, see if instead you could back up and go into looking at the hurt underneath the anger. If your usual response is to suppress your anger, then see if you could feel it and express it in your mind's eye or say it out loud. Nobody can hear you, not none of us anyway. So what could you say to that person? What would you want to say? Or maybe, your adult self could be there with your child self and let them tell you, "Oh, I I'm furious about this. This just caused me so much suffering." Just notice what it is. So try the opposite of your usual pattern and see what's there for you. And stay connected with your breath, with your body, with this moment. Right now, in this moment, you're safe in your room, wherever it is you are. And we're doing an inquiry. We're looking at something. We're feeling into it. So notice that too. And then the last minute or two before we finish the inquiry, notice what's going on in terms of avoidance. So if you're avoiding feeling the hurt, or if it just feels like it would be a crazy idea even to feel the anger or to express it, you notice that you're suppressing it or something. Notice what's been happening with those patterns as you think back over the last several minutes. What came up, and was it possible to stay with it? Did you find yourself talking yourself out of it or avoiding it somehow? And no making yourself right or wrong. It's not a right or wrong thing. We're just looking. Deep breaths. In about another minute, we'll come back to the group. So, finishing up what you're doing. All right.